Welcome back to another episode of the podcast Resilient Revival, where we explore the often unseen and overlooked aspects of our society. In this episode, we continue delving into the compelling topic of the living conditions in the abandoned buildings, shining a light on the unintended consequences that often arise from applying the creative and entrepreneurial thinking to the problem of abandoned buildings, particularly when redeveloping or revitalizing the buildings. We further discuss some of the strategies that have been implemented in addressing this issue. Nomzamo Zondo continues to provide us with the valuable insights into understanding this issue. We welcome you again, Nomzamo. I had gone through some of the articles where I read that the former mayor of Joburg, Herman Mashaba, wanted to address the abandoned buildings by converting them or refurbishing them to address the housing backlog. What is your take on that story?
So one of the interesting things is that there's been a phenomenon. As I said, before Mashaba was even a concept, before he was even thinking of running as a mayor of Johannesburg, before he even thought of joining politics, the concept has been for the city to be interested in the buildings. They're interested in the bricks and the mortar. No interest whatsoever in the people inside the buildings. So similarly, in fact, there is even a case that's very litigated, which was about Mashaba's attempts to wrestle buildings out of the hands of poor South Africans, of poor people living in the inner city. And in that case, he had started what was called as the inner city raids, and where he was using the police to intimidate and harass people out of unlawfully occupied buildings in the inner city of Johannesburg. And his stated aim was he wants to give these buildings to the private sector so the private sector can refurbish them. So for anyone who is interested in, maybe because you are an urban planner, anyone who's interested in buildings, great. Wonderful. But for anyone who's interested in people and the well-being of people, it's a completely different thing. And I think, to be fair, I'm being very plastic in saying as a town and urban planner, but I know as a town and urban planner, your interest is making sure that the planning is done in the interest of the population, of people. And so Mashaba's plan didn't consider those unlawful occupiers. It was, of course, also, it was making us very, very angry because we were engaged in the buildings the buildings that were getting raided were buildings where there was litigation. In fact, it was an intimidatory tactic. Because the law was protecting these people's homes, then they were using the police as a force to threaten them, and then to the point where people are like, we don't care what the law can do for us, we are leaving. We can't live a life. One of the buildings, Industry House, had been raided over 5 times in a space, I think, of 11 months. The 5th and worst raid happened at 3 a.m. In May, in what I think became one of the coldest winter days of that year. And of course, clearly, that attempt was to be able to say, okay, the property owner is unable to get the eviction because these people are inside this building. The people will not agree to leave because they have nowhere to go. But if we show them that living here is horrible, they will go on their own. And so it's like, all along we've been trying to say to the city of Johannesburg, great plans, but your plan to address the housing crisis can't just be about brick and mortar. It must be about making homes for people. And in fact, the fact that you are involved in legal processes in many of these buildings, you even have an opportunity because you know who they are, you know what their income is, you have the data at your fingertips to understand, okay, they are living here, what can they afford? If we're going to create other solutions, where do you create those solutions? And how do you move them? I think they speak about the term of decanting. if we're gonna renovate this building, where will they be in the meantime? And then when they come back here, how do we make sure this new building is affordable to them and also sustainable? None of those discussions have happened, and that's the concern. So in effect, almost the place where engagement happens around inner city housing, especially around people, is in the courts. There isn't a space in the political arena, in the IDPs, in the wards, to kind of say, if you look at Hillbrow, maybe now, yes, there aren't many unlawfully occupied buildings, but we have a few. What are we going to do about them? Are there any opportunities for the city of Johannesburg in taking over those buildings? Is the city of Johannesburg able to partner with the province to give them funding, possibly through the emergency housing program, to make those buildings habitable for people, and in that way make the city better for everyone? I mean, the Mayor Palatse, she used this term. She said the Joburg inner city is like the lounge of the city. It's the place that everyone passes through. So even if you are based in Soweto, or you are based in Diepsloot, or you are based in Sandton, or you work in Sandton from Soweto, you're going to pass through the inner city. And there's an interest in making sure that lounge is presentable, habitable, not just for the people who live in the inner city, but the people who are also using it for thoroughfare. But even with that beautiful analogy that Mayor Palatse puts on the table, there isn't a strategy, right, that involves making the city habitable for those who are already in it, right? And I'm saying those who are already in it because we know part of the problem that we have is urbanization. So if you're not already addressing the people that are there now, your problems are getting worse every day because there are others who are still coming. There are others who are still coming. And in effect, then you end up with a lounge that is debilitating for everyone, right? That is an eyesore. But that's because you haven't put up a strategy to manage the inner city, to address the inner city. And in fact, it's amazing because the complaint is always, the inner city is so dirty, and the complaint is against people who live in the inner city, forgetting it is the lounge. The reason it's dirty is because you have so many thousands of people passing through on a daily basis. Some of them are not even residents of Joburg. Some of them are coming from Springs. Some of them are coming from Mogale City. Some of them, they're coming from all over Gauteng, and they're passing through this inner city of Joburg. But you're not allocating resources to manage that, and then instead you then blame the people who make a living in the inner city, informal traders. You then blame the people who live in the inner city. But you could actually just have a strategy that seeks to address
makes sense,
taking into account all of the full context of what the inner city is, to those who don't live in it, to those who live in it, to those who make business in it. And one of the things that's been important to us around, on the challenges of people living in these buildings. So the first challenge is access to basic services, because if you're not getting along with the owner of the property, chances are, one, you're going to struggle to engage with the city on basic services. Two, unless you are organized, and there are a few buildings that are very organized, where people have come together, they collect money and they pay directly to the city to make sure that they have those basic services, you would have at some point experienced a disconnection of services, or are using those services through unlawful connections, which then means that you're also at the mercy. Any day, city power will come, they'll disconnect. You live in those circumstances. So the first problem that we have is that residents have is how do we make sure that we have basic services, just at the level of, one, we have electricity, we have water, we have sanitation, but two, a bigger problem is that these buildings are old, right? They are old, and because of that, there's challenges of infrastructure. So sometimes in terms of sanitation, they might not even, the pipes might be rotten. So actually they can't have sanitation in the building. Outside of that, even like some of the problems are even bigger. Like you have problems of maybe in terms of the infrastructure, the fire escape is now broken. So there is no working fire escape, which means that if there's a risk of fire, someone could die. Or even something even bigger, where in some of the buildings it might be that you're living comfortably, but there's a problem of waterproofing, that the waterproofing is worn out. And it's the kind of problem that people can't address because the costs are so high. You know, it needs $1 million, it needs $2 million to fix the waterproofing or just put it in place in the building. So those are the problems. There are also other problems, right? That unless the community is very organized and they manage the building themselves, or they have a good relationship with the owner and the owner helps them manage it, the moment that it doesn't have electricity, for instance, then people who are opportunistic think it's a place, for instance, when it comes to crime, they know that if I snatch this lady's bag, if I run into this building, no one will follow me. People will be scared to go inside here. Those are problems that people in the inner city are dealing with. And as I've said, the biggest problem is also the fact that they don't have a relationship with the city of Johannesburg, where they can actually go to the city and say, we live here, we live under a city, these are the problems that we have. The door of the city feels permanently closed to them. When it is open, it's open in a way that treats them as an unwanted stepchild. So when the city comes to them, it's them coming with a raid, like in the time of Mayor Mashaba, or it's coming to them with an eviction application, basically saying, we want you out of this building. Or even worse, that is coming to them with the police to evict them without even a court order. So there's like the language, the engagement between the occupiers and the city is not really one of residents to an authority they've given power to. It's really to like an unwanted group of people. And I think that's the biggest problem, because I feel like even if there was minimal cooperation between the city and inner city and unlawful occupiers in these buildings, there would be a lot less stress.
So does the abandoned buildings affect like the surrounding community outside of the crime that you've mentioned, like maybe the property rates and all those things?
Look, I mean, so one of the buildings that I mentioned earlier, which is Industry House, in Industry House, the neighboring owner, right, was complaining so much about the building that he went and decided to buy it, and then become the person who's gonna push out the eviction. I know that at some point there was another building, just to give you an example, which was owned by the Bank of Mozambique. And that building, it was the neighboring buildings were complaining that this building is so dirty that it's affecting our environment and even our business, because some of them were commercial property owners who are renting out doctors' rooms, others are renting out to creches, and they're saying, but this now, we can't run away from the fact that and in that case, they took the city to court to say, you must clean this building and make it habitable in a way that it doesn't affect our environment. And therefore, it actually creates friction even between the city and other residents, because the environment is bad for everyone. In the same way that I mentioned about the lounge, that the inner city, a well-run inner city, is to the benefit of all of Joburg and possibly all of Gauteng. But a badly run inner city affects everyone as well.
Okay, I heard you mentioned the city evicting the people. I think I read somewhere that there's a strategy, I don't know if it's part of the inner city housing strategy, that they have to provide sort of like temporary accommodation for the people when they want to evict them. Is that happening, or that is just some sort of a strategy but they're not really implementing?
So it's not just a strategy, right? It's actually the law. So in South Africa, as part of as a recognition of our specific context of landlessness, of people being pushed out without any consideration of what will happen to them. The law in South Africa now is that when you can't kick anyone out of their home, without having that being authorized by a court. And a court can't authorize the eviction of people without knowing who those people are, what their circumstances, what will happen to them if they are evicted. And then even that court, the moment that it finds out that actually if they are evicted, they'll end up homeless, right? Then the court must require the municipality to provide them with alternative accommodation. And that's been the law now for people who are being evicted by private property owners since 2011. So it's been the law for over 12 years. And unfortunately, if you then look at how many buildings that's been applied to, it's very few. In fact, in 2014, the city of Joburg brought an application that it called the stay application, because it was saying they had been challenged in how they're providing temporary emergency accommodation, because the accommodation that they were providing, they gave 3 conditions. One, you'd only be able to stay in that accommodation for 6 months. That didn't make sense if there are no options for you to go to. So if there is no affordable rental, when the 6 months end, you're in the same position that you were on day 0. 2, they were requiring that families be separated by gender, so that women and young girls would stay alone, and men and young men would stay alone. And then the third thing is that they were locking out. The accommodation was only available from 5 in the evening, again until the morning. It wasn't available during the day. And there was a court case to challenge that. And so in 2014, when they applied, they said, until this court case is resolved, we cannot provide the accommodation. But the court case finally was determined by the Concord in 2017. And the Concord said, you simply can't do this. You can't take someone who had a home and put them in a partial home where you've split them from their families. It actually shows that you have no respect for their right to dignity, and you have no respect for their right to family life. And you must provide them with accommodation that it replaces the accommodation that they had. And since then, I think, maybe to my knowledge, the city has provided, I think, in the inner city of Joburg, accommodation to maybe 7 buildings that have been evicted. And in fact, is it still recording?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. So that now people who are in the same court process are being told, wait, when we have accommodation, we'll get to you. In fact, the city is now filing affidavits saying it might take us 2 to 3 years to get accommodation. So for now, we have nothing. That's what the city is saying in the applications that we've been involved in. There's been very few where they've said, here is a plan. The building that I spoke to you about before, Remington Court, the eviction was started in 2012. We opposed in 2013. We're in 2023 now. There is no alternative accommodation being offered to that community. So the property owner, as I said, the property has changed hands, but the property owners have been waiting for 10 years for the city to provide alternative accommodation. Okay. And at this point, as of today, there is no offer of where they could go.
Very challenging. I heard you touched a very sensitive topic about... Oh no, actually, it's one of my questions. What are the implications or the consequences of the property developers, the city, exercising the entrepreneurial mind or trying to make business out of the abandoned buildings? What are some of the consequences? What happens if they do that?
Look, I mean, it's displacement, right? It's displacement. And so, for instance, you can look at Maboneng and what happened with Maboneng and how it displaced a lot of people who used to live in that area of Joburg. The one thing about the inner city as a housing option for many people is that, one, it's close to livelihood opportunities. In a situation like ours where very few people are permanently employed, so many people who are unemployed try and find means to make a life for themselves. So the inner city keeps them close to those opportunities. For those who are employed, who are categorized as the working poor, the inner city is a place where they are able to connect. So if you work in Sandton, you're one taxi away from Sandton. If you work in Bryanston, you're one taxi away from Bryanston, as opposed to being maybe 2 or 3 taxis away. But also, the one thing is that also because of informal trade, there's a feeling that, yes, the inner city is hard and you can struggle, but also you can be able to get something to sleep, to eat, to sleep that night, support your children. And if, for instance, we were to allow the entrepreneurial spirit to be the guide of what happens to the inner city, then all of that would die. Many academics speak about the social value of land, the social value of property. That social value would mean nothing because, in effect, all you would prioritize is the fact that someone has money. And I think for the city, always the argument is when property owners take over the building, that there'll be revenue. But there'll be revenue to do what? And as I've said again, it's historically important for South Africa. We're not a country of equal opportunities. In effect, when the city allows the entrepreneurial spirit to be what guides it and propels it, then what it does actually it supports discrimination. It ensures that special apartheid, special segregation continues, with black poor people being pushed out into the margins, and the center and the core being preserved for those with money. And that's not something some of us are comfortable with allowing to see, which means that then we are kind of at times placed in an adversarial position to the state. But for us, our guide is the Constitution, which says we must address the injustices of our past. It is the same Constitution which puts forward a vision that says the lives of people living in South Africa, the quality of their lives will be improved on a daily basis. And for us, we feel that the city should not be putting us in a place where we are going back on the fulfillment of rights instead of going forward. And if we were going forward, then we'd be saying, okay, here are this group of people who are unlawful occupiers, who have no secure tenure, who don't have the right to property because of the historical context. And what we want to do is we want to push them a little bit further. So they don't have secure tenure today. They don't have access to basic services. Here we'll address the issue of services. Here we'll think of ways how to address the issue of tenure. We'll think of ways of moving them forward on a daily basis. And also creating an environment where people are not just unlawful. I feel like even the fact that people are unlawful occupiers is something that undermines their dignity. It undermines their claim as people who live in South Africa.
Apologies for cutting you off there, but I have to end this episode. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing from you on our next episode.